May 8, 1945, Camp Shanks, New York, the German prisoner stepped off the transport truck onto American soil for the first time, his worn Wehrmacht boots meeting concrete still damp from morning rain. The air tasted different here, salt from the Hudson River mixing with something sweet he could not identify, something that seemed to drift from the sprawling compound beyond the wire. Through the fence, he could see American soldiers laughing, their uniforms clean and pressed, their movements casual in a way that seemed almost obscene to men who had survived the collapsing Eastern Front. One soldier walked past carrying a green glass bottle, condensation beading on its surface despite the cool May air. The prisoner watched him tilt the bottle back, drink deeply, then toss the empty into a bin already overflowing with identical bottles. The casual waste of it struck like a physical blow. In the prisoner's entire 4 years of military service, he had never seen a soldier discard anything that might still have use. And then he saw the sign, hand-painted in neat English letters he could barely read. Coca-Cola 5 cents. 5 cents. The price seemed impossibly low, incomprehensibly cheap for a beverage in a glass bottle. He had spent the last 3 months eating sawdust bread and drinking ersatz coffee made from acorns. He had watched friends die for lack of medical supplies, while American bombers flew overhead with impunity metal birds that seemed to multiply like locusts regardless of how many were shot down. And now he stood in a prisoner compound where soldiers casually bought bottled drinks for pocket change. The cognitive dissonance was total. Everything he had been told about America, about its weakness and decadence and imminent collapse, about the superiority of German discipline and sacrifice, seemed to evaporate in the face of that 5-cent Coca-Cola bottle sweating in the spring air. For 4 years, the German soldier had believed in the narrative of scarcity as virtue, of sacrifice as strength, of austerity as moral superiority. The Nazi ideology that had shaped his understanding of the world taught that Germany's hunger made it lean and strong, that rationing built character, that the German people's willingness to endure hardship demonstrated their fitness to rule. America, by contrast, was soft. America was corrupt. America was a mongrel nation of immigrants and Jews and Negroes, fractured by internal contradictions, weakened by luxury, incapable of sustained sacrifice. The Führer had said so. The radio had said so. The officers had said so. The evidence of 4 years of war seemed to confirm it. Germany had conquered France in 6 weeks. Germany had driven to the gates of Moscow. Germany had built weapons of unprecedented sophistication, jets and rockets and tanks that outclassed anything the enemy fielded. Surely such achievements proved German superiority. Surely the hardships endured, the cities destroyed, the millions dead, surely all of it meant something. Surely it demonstrated that German spirit could overcome material disadvantage through sheer will. But the 5-cent Coca-Cola suggested a different story. It suggested that American abundance was not weakness, but strength, that industrial capacity mattered more than ideological purity, that a nation which could supply its soldiers with bottled soft drinks at prices so low they seemed like jokes had resources Germany could never match. The prisoner had known intellectually that America was large and wealthy, but knowing facts and understanding their implications were different things. He had believed that German efficiency would overcome American waste, that quality would triumph over quantity, that discipline would defeat decadence. The 5-cent Coca-Cola, more than any battle or bombing raid, more than the surrender documents signed at Rheims, communicated the fundamental miscalculation that had doomed the Third Reich from the moment Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941. The story of German prisoners encountering American abundance in POW camps across the United States represented one of the great ideological confrontations of the 20th century, a collision between fascist narratives of scarcity and democratic narratives of plenty, between totalitarian visions of sacrifice and capitalist visions of consumption. These encounters happened thousands of times, in hundreds of camps, as more than 371,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States between 1943 and 1945. They came from North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had finally collapsed under the weight of Allied numerical superiority. They came from Sicily and Italy, where Wehrmacht divisions had fought desperate rearguard actions against armies that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and fuel. They came from France after D-Day, from the Bulge after that final desperate offensive failed, from the Ruhr pocket as Germany itself disintegrated. They came expecting prison camps to be grim places of deprivation, expecting to find America exhausted by war, expecting confirmation that their sacrifices had not been in vain because the enemy was suffering too. Instead, they found abundance beyond comprehension. They found camps where prisoners received 4,000 calories per day, more food than most had eaten since before the war began. They found barracks heated in winter and cooled in summer. They found recreational facilities, sports equipment, musical instruments, libraries stocked with books. They found medical care that exceeded what most German soldiers had received on active duty. They found camp canteens where they could purchase cigarettes, candy, soft drinks, and sundries at prices that seemed surreal, and most symbolically, most fundamentally challenging to their understanding of how the world worked. They found Coca-Cola for 5 cents a bottle. The Coca-Cola company had been intertwined with American military operations since 1941, when company president Robert Woodruff declared that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is, and whatever it costs the company. This was not mere patriotism or corporate philanthropy. It was brilliant marketing disguised as war support, a strategy to embed Coca-Cola into the daily lives of millions of servicemen who would return home as loyal customers. The military agreed enthusiastically. Coca-Cola, with its sugar and caffeine, provided a quick energy boost. More importantly, it provided a taste of home, a connection to civilian life, a small luxury that made military service marginally more bearable. By 1945, the Coca-Cola Company had established 64 bottling plants around the world to supply American troops. These plants were priority logistics targets, receiving resources and transportation that might otherwise have gone to ammunition or medicine. Because military leadership understood that morale mattered, that small comforts sustained fighting spirit, that an army that could provide its soldiers with cold, soft drinks in the middle of a desert or jungle was an army that believed in its ultimate victory. The decision to allow prisoners of war access to these canteens, to permit them to purchase Coca-Cola and other American consumer goods at the same 5-cent price American soldiers paid, was both practical and psychological. Practically, it simplified camp administration. Rather than maintain separate pricing structures for prisoners and guards, camp simply extended the same privileges to everyone. Psychologically, it served multiple purposes. It demonstrated American adherence to Geneva Convention standards for prisoner treatment. It reduced tensions in camps by giving prisoners something to look forward to, small luxuries that made captivity more tolerable. And whether consciously intended or not, it delivered a devastating propaganda message about the relative strength of the American and German economies. For the German prisoners, the initial reaction was disbelief, followed by attempts to rationalize what they were seeing. Some believed the camps were special facilities designed to impress prisoners with fake abundance. Surely the rest of America must be suffering, must be experiencing the same shortages and rationing that had characterized German civilian life since 1940. Surely these well-stocked canteens were theater, a psychological operation designed to break their morale. But as weeks turned to months, as letters from other prisoners in other camps described identical conditions, as they spoke with guards and civilian workers, and began to understand that American civilians were also not starving, that American cities had not been bombed into rubble, that rationing in America meant giving up butter for margarine rather than eating bread made from sawdust and potato peels, the cognitive dissonance became impossible to maintain. They had to confront a reality their ideology had declared impossible, that the soft, decadent Americans had crushed the hard, disciplined Germans through sheer material abundance. That quantity had its own quality, that industrial capacity mattered more than martial virtue. The price of Coca-Cola became the measure of this revelation. 5 cents. In April 1945, as Germany collapsed, the black market price for a single cigarette in Berlin was 50 Reichsmarks. A loaf of bread cost 300 Reichsmarks, if bread could be found at all. German soldiers had been issued methamphetamines to compensate for inadequate rations. German civilians had been eating dogs and rats. The gap between German scarcity and American abundance had grown so wide that it exceeded the capacity of price mechanisms to express. A bottle of Coca-Cola in Germany, had such a thing existed, would have been literally priceless, beyond the reach of any currency. And yet here in an American prisoner camp, it cost 5 cents, the same nickel that bought a Coca-Cola represented, in Reichsmark exchange rates that no longer had any meaningful relationship to purchasing power, perhaps 15 Reichsmarks. In real terms, it represented the price difference between an economy geared entirely to military production, consuming itself in the process, and an economy so vast that it could simultaneously supply its military, maintain civilian consumption, feed much of the Allied world through Lend-Lease, and still offer prisoners of war access to consumer goods at prices that made consumption casual rather than precious. The Coca-Cola bottle itself became a symbol of this abundance in prisoner memories and letters. It was made of glass, a material that Germany had largely ceased using for non-military purposes by 1943. The bottle was green, requiring manufacturing processes that Germany no longer had resources to maintain for consumer goods. It was cold, implying refrigeration in a nation that was struggling to keep hospital operating rooms heated. It was standardized, every bottle identical to every other bottle, demonstrating industrial precision that Germany still possessed for weapons, but could no longer maintain for consumer products. It was disposable, designed to be used once and discarded, embodying a relationship with material goods that was antithetical to German wartime experience where everything was saved, repaired, reused until it literally fell apart. And it was available, sitting in metal coolers behind counters where prisoners could simply walk up and purchase one whenever they had 5 cents. No ration card required, no queuing for hours hoping supplies would not run out, no connections to officials necessary, just 5 cents and the bottle was yours. Some prisoners refused to buy Coca-Cola at first, viewing it as a betrayal of loyalty to the fatherland or an acceptance of their defeat. These men maintained that German hardship was noble, that the deprivation they had endured made them stronger, that American abundance proved American weakness rather than strength. But their resistance rarely lasted long. The physical and psychological comfort of having something sweet and cold to drink, of exercising consumer choice for the first time in months or years, proved too attractive. More fundamentally, the sustained exposure to American plenty eroded the ideological framework that made their resistance meaningful. When every day brought new evidence that America had resources Germany could not match, when guards complained about minor inconveniences that would have seemed like luxuries in Germany, when newspapers available in camp libraries casually reported production figures that exceeded German wartime capacity, when the cumulative weight of evidence became overwhelming, most prisoners simply surrendered their beliefs along with their weapons. The transformation this engendered was documented extensively by American officials and researchers who studied prisoner psychology. The U.S. War Department, working with academic psychologists, conducted systematic interviews with German POWs to understand their ideological commitments and assess the potential for re-education. These interviews, many of which were preserved in military archives and declassified in subsequent decades, revealed a consistent pattern. Prisoners captured early in the war, particularly those taken in North Africa in 1943, tended to retain strong Nazi beliefs initially. They explained defeats as temporary setbacks, maintained faith in secret weapons that would turn the tide, believed that internal enemies and traitors had undermined German success, but sustained exposure to American conditions, particularly the contrast between their treatment as prisoners and what they knew of conditions in Germany, systematically eroded these beliefs. By the time of their eventual repatriation to Germany in 1946 and 1947, many prisoners had undergone profound ideological transformations, abandoning Nazi beliefs not through coercion or indoctrination, but through simple confrontation with material reality that made those beliefs untenable. The 5-cent Coca-Cola was the most accessible symbol of this reality, but it was part of a larger constellation of abundance that prisoners encountered. Camp canteens also sold Hershey chocolate bars, another product that had become legendary among German soldiers who had captured them from American dead or prisoners earlier in the war. Chocolate had been a luxury in Germany even before the war. By 1943, it had effectively disappeared from civilian markets, reserved exclusively for military rations, and even then issued sparingly. American soldiers, by contrast, had chocolate included in their standard field rations. The D-ration that every American soldier carried included 4-ounce bars of chocolate, designed to survive extreme temperatures. The waste implicit in designing chocolate specifically to be carried into combat, the casual abundance of providing every soldier with candy as standard equipment, struck German prisoners as almost incomprehensible. And in the canteens, prisoners could buy Hershey bars for 5 or 10 cents, could eat chocolate daily if they wished, could experience as casual consumption what had been reserved for special occasions even in peacetime Germany. The canteens sold cigarettes, and here too the price differential communicated economic realities. In the camp canteens, a pack of 20 cigarettes cost 15 or 20 cents. On the black market in Germany, a single American cigarette could be traded for food, clothing, or sexual services. American cigarettes had become a universal currency in the chaos of collapsing Germany, valued far above Reichsmarks that could not purchase anything, because nothing was available to purchase. German prisoners observed American guards smoking constantly, lighting new cigarettes from the butts of old ones, sometimes discarding partially smoked cigarettes because they had become too short to hold comfortably. The casual waste of tobacco struck men who had carefully collected and re-rolled cigarette butts with something approaching horror. It was one thing to lose a war. It was another thing to realize you had never had any chance of winning it, that the enemy's industrial capacity exceeded yours by such a margin that they could afford to waste resources you would have treasured. The food served to prisoners exceeded the rations American civilians received under wartime rationing. A typical daily menu might include bacon and eggs for breakfast, beef or pork for lunch, chicken or fish for dinner, with unlimited bread, butter, milk, coffee, and vegetables. Some camps provided ice cream weekly. Many offered special holiday meals that included turkey, ham, and multiple desserts. German prisoners who had been subsisting on black bread, watery soup, and occasional small portions of meat found themselves gaining weight in captivity, sometimes 10 or 20 pounds in the first few months of imprisonment. They wrote letters home describing their meals, but these letters were often censored because American authorities worried that descriptions of prisoner abundance would harm morale among Allied soldiers who were still fighting and dying, or would seem like propaganda that families in Germany would not believe. The medical care prisoners received was similarly incomprehensible in its thoroughness. German military medicine had been sophisticated in peacetime, but had deteriorated drastically as the war consumed resources. By 1944, frontline German medical facilities lacked basic supplies like bandages, antiseptics, and anesthetics. Soldiers died of infections that could have been prevented with antibiotics. Operations were performed without proper anesthesia. Blood transfusions were unavailable. German prisoners arriving in American camps often carried infections, malnutrition-related diseases, dental problems, and untreated injuries. American military doctors treated all of these conditions, using penicillin that had only recently become widely available, performing dental work that gave prisoners better teeth than they had possessed before the war, providing glasses and hearing aids and prosthetics that exceeded the quality of German military medical devices. Some prisoners received medical treatment that was superior to what they would have received in Germany even before the war began. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The physical infrastructure of the camps themselves told a story about American capacity. Most camps were constructed specifically to house prisoners, built in months by crews using standardized designs and prefabricated components. The barracks were wooden structures with electricity, plumbing, heating, and insulation. The compounds included mess halls, recreation buildings, infirmaries, chapels, theaters, and workshops. The construction quality and speed of building communicated several messages simultaneously. First, that America had enough lumber, concrete, copper wiring, and plumbing fixtures to construct entire towns for prisoners, while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and weapons. Second, that America had enough labor and equipment to complete these construction projects quickly, despite having millions of men in uniform. Third, that America considered prisoner welfare important enough to invest substantial resources in their accommodation, rather than simply confining them in minimal facilities, as would have been militarily sufficient. The camps represented abundance deployed for humanitarian purposes, abundance so vast that it could be extended even to enemies. The recreational facilities particularly astonished prisoners. Many camps had baseball fields, volleyball courts, and soccer fields. Some had swimming pools. Most provided musical instruments and organized bands and orchestras. Many showed movies, sometimes twice weekly, films that were recent releases rather than propaganda films. Some camps organized educational programs and classes where prisoners could learn English, study technical subjects, or pursue artistic interests. The opportunity to study and learn as a prisoner of war was itself remarkable. The provision of entertainment and leisure activities for prisoners seemed to violate every principle of military necessity and wartime austerity that German soldiers had internalized. Why would a nation fighting a global war invest resources in providing entertainment for captured enemies? The only explanation that made sense was that America had resources so abundant that providing for prisoner recreation simply did not register as a meaningful expense. The Guards presented another form of cognitive dissonance. American military police assigned to POW camps were often older men who had been drafted late or were physically unfit for combat duty. They were supplemented by soldiers recovering from wounds, by men awaiting discharge, by troops cycling through between deployments. Many of these guards were casual and informal in ways that violated German military protocol. They chatted with prisoners. They traded cigarettes for crafts or souvenirs. They complained openly about military regulations and expressed skepticism about military leadership. Some acknowledged that they would rather be home. This informality, this apparent lack of discipline, had been cited in German propaganda as evidence of American military weakness. But prisoners observed that these apparently undisciplined guards were backed by an infrastructure of such overwhelming power that discipline became unnecessary. The guards did not need to maintain rigid military bearing because they were not afraid of the prisoners, because the fence was strong and the guard towers were manned, and the entire apparatus of American military power guaranteed that prisoners would remain imprisoned regardless of how casually individual guards behaved. The guards' informality was a luxury afforded by security, not a weakness. Some prisoners were assigned to work details outside the camps, working on farms or in factories where labor shortages existed. These work details were governed by Geneva Convention rules that required prisoners to be paid for their labor, though at reduced rates. The experience of working alongside American civilians provided additional perspective on American society. Prisoners discovered that American farmers, even in wartime, had tractors and trucks and mechanical equipment that made German farming methods seem medieval. They discovered that American factories had automation and assembly line processes that explained how America could produce so many ships and planes and tanks. They discovered that American workers expected 8-hour workdays, lunch breaks, and weekends off, that American labor unions negotiated with employers from positions of strength, that American civilians complained about gas rationing and sugar rationing, but otherwise lived lives of comfort that exceeded what most Germans had experienced even before the war. These discoveries progressively dismantled the narrative of American weakness and decadence that had sustained German morale. The letters prisoners wrote home, those that passed censorship, attempted to explain these discoveries to families in Germany. But the gap between prisoner experience and German civilian reality had become so large that meaningful communication was nearly impossible. A prisoner trying to explain that he could buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents was writing to family members who were eating grass and tree bark to supplement starvation rations. A prisoner describing his weight gain was writing to family members who were dying of malnutrition-related diseases. A prisoner mentioning that he had watched a movie was writing to family members whose cities had been bombed into rubble, who lived in cellars and burned furniture for warmth, who scavenged through ruins for anything useful. The prisoners' letters often expressed guilt, a sense that their comfort in captivity was somehow shameful while Germany suffered. Some letters expressed disbelief at their own experiences, as if the writers needed to document what they had seen, because they feared they would not believe their own memories once they returned home. The German officers imprisoned in American camps responded to these conditions with a range of reactions that generally tracked with their level of commitment to Nazi ideology. Some officers maintained rigid adherence to Nazi beliefs, organizing resistance cells within the camps, attempting to enforce discipline among prisoner populations, punishing prisoners who became too friendly with American guards or expressed anti-Nazi sentiments. These hardcore Nazi prisoners sometimes engaged in violence against other prisoners, intimidating or assaulting those who cooperated with American authorities or abandoned Nazi ideology. American camp administrators worked to identify and segregate these die-hard Nazis into separate facilities, but the presence of ideological true believers created tensions in many camps. These officers insisted that German suffering was meaningful sacrifice for a worthy cause, that American abundance was built on Jewish financial manipulation and would collapse, that secret weapons or political miracles would still deliver German victory. Their beliefs, increasingly detached from reality as the war ended and Germany's total defeat became undeniable, were sustained only by refusing to engage with evidence that contradicted their worldview. Most officers, however, followed a more pragmatic path. They maintained formal military bearing, respected rank structures, complied with American regulations while preserving dignity, and slowly adjusted their understanding of the war based on accumulating evidence. Many of these officers had been products of the old Prussian military tradition, rather than Nazi party activists. They had fought because Germany was at war, not because they believed in Hitler's racial theories or geopolitical fantasies. For these men, the comfort of American captivity was both relief and humiliation. Relief because they had survived, because they were safe, because the war was over for them. Humiliation because their comfort in captivity contrasted so sharply with the suffering of their comrades still fighting, or of their families in Germany. Some officers later wrote memoirs describing their time in American POW camps, and a common theme was the psychological difficulty of reconciling their training to endure hardship with the reality that captivity was more comfortable than military service had been. The enlisted men, freed from the rigid hierarchies of military service, experienced liberation within captivity. For many, imprisonment in America was the first time in their adult lives they had not been subject to constant military discipline and ideological indoctrination. They could relax, they could think their own thoughts, they could question the narratives they had been taught. They could admit, at least to themselves, that much of what they had been told was lies. The 5-cent Coca-Cola became for these men a symbol of freedom, not despite being a capitalist consumer product, but precisely because it was one. The ability to walk up to a canteen, spend 5 cents, and receive a cold bottle of soda represented a form of freedom. Economic freedom, consumer freedom, the freedom to make choices, however trivial, that they had not experienced since before the war and perhaps never. Nazi ideology had promised greatness, glory, conquest, racial superiority, historical destiny. It had delivered death, destruction, and defeat. America promised nothing more than the opportunity to buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents. But it delivered on that promise, and the cumulative weight of thousands of small promises kept beat the grand promises broken. The Coca-Cola Company, for its part, understood the symbolic power of its product. Internal company documents from the war years, preserved in corporate archives, show that executives viewed military consumption as a long-term investment in brand loyalty. Every soldier who developed a Coca-Cola habit during military service would return home as a consumer. Every foreign national who tasted Coca-Cola, whether as ally, liberated civilian, or prisoner of war, became a potential customer in post-war markets. The 5-cent price was maintained even when it meant the company accepted losses, because executives understood that the real value was not immediate profit but long-term market penetration. Coca-Cola was selling more than a beverage. It was selling an experience an association with American power and plenty, a taste that would forever be linked to the memory of American generosity and abundance. The German prisoners who drank 5-cent Coca-Colas in American POW camps were being marketed to, though few realized it at the time. They were being converted into missionaries who would return to Germany, carrying not just memories of American military power, but memories of American consumer culture. Memories that would shape West German society's embrace of American-style capitalism in the post-war years. The repatriation of German prisoners began in 1946 and continued through 1947. Many prisoners were reluctant to return to Germany, where conditions remained desperate and food shortages persisted. Some requested permission to remain in the United States, though few were granted this privilege initially. The journey back to Germany was physically and psychologically difficult. Men who had spent months or years in American abundance were transported back to a country they barely recognized, where cities were rubble and infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of people were homeless and starving. The contrast between the country they had left and the country they returned to was stark. But perhaps even more stark was the contrast between the life they had lived as prisoners in America and the life they returned to as free men in Germany. Many former prisoners found themselves nostalgic for American captivity, for the regular meals and heated barracks and recreational activities they had taken for granted. Some later immigrated to the United States when immigration restrictions eased. Many more became advocates for American-style democracy and market economics as West Germany rebuilt. The experience of German POWs in American camps became a controversial topic in post-war Germany. Some Germans viewed the stories of comfortable captivity as humiliating, as proof that German soldiers had surrendered too easily, as evidence of weakness. Others viewed the contrast between American treatment of prisoners and Soviet treatment of prisoners as validation of Western values over communist values. German prisoners who had been held by the Soviets returned years later, if they returned at all, broken by labor camps and starvation and brutal treatment. German prisoners who had been held by the Americans returned well-fed and healthy, some speaking English, many with favorable views of American society. The divergent experiences of German POWs in American versus Soviet captivity became a powerful argument for Western alignment during the Cold War. Those who had seen American abundance firsthand, who had experienced American relatively benign treatment, became advocates for West Germany's integration into Western economic and military structures. The Coca-Cola bottle, that simple symbol of 5-cent abundance, carried this argument forward through decades. When West Germany rebuilt and joined the capitalist West, when Coca-Cola became ubiquitous in German shops and restaurants, when German children grew up drinking the same soda that their fathers had encountered as prisoners of war, the symbolic victory was complete. Coca-Cola represented American cultural imperialism. Critics argued the subordination of authentic national cultures to homogenized corporate consumerism. But it also represented choice and prosperity and peace. The generation of Germans who had fought against America and lost, who had experienced both Nazi scarcity and American abundance, largely chose abundance. They chose democracy and capitalism and integration with the West. And while many factors influenced these choices, the memory of 5-cent Coca-Cola in POW camp canteens was part of the story. The broader lesson, the one that echoed through Cold War confrontations and continues resonating today, was that ideology cannot indefinitely contradict material reality. Nazi Germany had constructed an elaborate worldview that explained German hardship as strength and American abundance as weakness. This worldview was internally consistent and emotionally satisfying and politically useful. But it was false, and exposure to contradicting evidence eventually forced even committed believers to adjust their understanding. The 5-cent Coca-Cola was not an argument. It was a fact. It existed. It could be purchased. It was cold and sweet and refreshing. No amount of ideological commitment could make it not exist or transform its existence into evidence of American weakness. And when thousands of small facts accumulated, when every day brought new evidence that America had resources Germany lacked, when material conditions persistently contradicted ideological narratives, the narratives crumbled. This same dynamic played out repeatedly across the 20th century. Soviet citizens who traveled to the West and saw stocked supermarkets and consumer abundance returned home with damaged faith in communist promises. North Koreans who escaped to South Korea and discovered that the despised southern puppet state was vastly wealthier than the glorious northern socialist paradise experienced ideological crises. Chinese students who studied abroad and observed Western prosperity struggled to reconcile their observations with party doctrine about capitalist exploitation and socialist superiority. In each case, sustained exposure to material abundance undermined narratives of scarcity as virtue. The authoritarian response to this challenge was to limit exposure, to restrict foreign travel, to control information, to prevent citizens from seeing evidence that contradicted official narratives. But this defensive posture itself acknowledged the power of the challenge, acknowledged that ideology could not survive unrestricted contact with competing material realities. The German prisoners who encountered 5-cent Coca-Cola were on the front lines of this ideological struggle, though few recognized it at the time. They were experiencing, in the most immediate and personal way, the collision between totalitarian narratives and democratic realities. The Nazi state had promised them greatness achieved through sacrifice. The democratic United States offered them Coca-Cola for 5 cents. By every measure that mattered to actual human beings living actual lives, the Coca-Cola was more valuable than the promise of greatness. It was real, it was available, it was affordable, it delivered immediate satisfaction rather than deferred glory, and its very existence demonstrated that the society that produced it had capabilities the society that promised greatness lacked. In the decades that followed, marketing executives and political scientists and historians would analyze the power of consumer culture as a weapon in ideological competition. They would discuss soft power and cultural influence and the spread of American values through American products. They would debate whether this represented genuine superiority of democratic capitalism or merely superior marketing of an equally flawed system. But for the German prisoners standing in camp canteens in 1945, holding cold Coca-Cola bottles and trying to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught, the academic debates were irrelevant. They had discovered a simple truth, that systems which provide their people with comfort and choice and small daily pleasures are more resilient than systems that demand sacrifice for abstract ideals. That material abundance is itself a kind of freedom, that the ability to buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents represents something important about how societies function and what makes them sustainable. The guards who had casually discarded half-full bottles, the soldiers who complained about minor inconveniences while surrounded by plenty, the civilians who took abundance for granted because they had never known anything else. These Americans embodied a form of power that Germans had not anticipated and could not counter. It was not the power of superior warriors or advanced weapons or brilliant strategy, though America possessed all these things. It was the power of a society so productive that it could be casual about waste, so secure that it could be informal about discipline, so confident that it could treat captured enemies with decent comfort, because their suffering served no purpose, and their conversion served several. This was democratic power, capitalist power, the power of systems that aligned material incentives with human desires, rather than demanding that human desires be subordinated to systemic requirements. The 5-cent Coca-Cola asked no sacrifice. It demanded no loyalty. It promised only what it delivered, a sweet, cold drink in a glass bottle. But in that simplicity lay a challenge to every ideology that promised transcendent meaning through suffering, every system that demanded present sacrifice for future glory, every doctrine that elevated abstract principles above immediate human needs. The challenge was not rhetorical but material, not argued but demonstrated. And for German prisoners who had spent years enduring hardship in service of a cause that delivered only defeat and death, who had believed that their suffering proved their virtue, and that enemy comfort proved enemy weakness, who had staked their understanding of meaning and purpose on narratives that material reality systematically contradicted, the 5-cent Coca-Cola represented total ideological defeat. Some never recovered from this defeat, never found alternative frameworks to replace the beliefs that American abundance had destroyed. They returned to Germany bitter and disillusioned, unwilling to embrace the democratic capitalism of the West, but unable to reconstruct the Nazi worldview that American captivity had demolished. Others found liberation in the collapse of their old beliefs, discovered that life without grand ideological commitments could be fuller and richer than life spent serving abstract causes. They rebuilt their lives around family and work and small pleasures, around the ordinary satisfactions of peace and prosperity, around the simple freedom to buy a Coca-Cola when they wanted one without needing permission or ration cards or connections. They had learned, through direct experience, that the good life was not a reward for historical struggle or racial purity or ideological commitment. The good life was the life that actual human beings wanted to live, and democratic capitalism, for all its flaws and contradictions, delivered that life more reliably than fascist glory. In the final accounting, the story of 5-cent Coca-Cola in American POW camps was a story about power and its many forms. Military power had defeated Germany on the battlefield, destroyed its armies, occupied its territory. But economic power, demonstrated through casual abundance rather than deliberate coercion, defeated Germany ideologically. The prisoners who drank 5-cent Coca-Cola and returned to Germany carrying memories of American plenty became agents of cultural transformation, carriers of a vision that shaped post-war German society more than any occupation policy or re-education program could have achieved. They had seen the future, and the future was prosperous and comfortable and boring and free. The future offered 5-cent Coca-Cola and complained when ice cream flavors were limited by wartime rationing. The future was unimpressive and undisciplined and absolutely, overwhelmingly victorious. The Coca-Cola bottle became, in German prisoner memory and eventually in German historical consciousness, a symbol of this reality. Museums that preserve POW camp artifacts sometimes display those green glass bottles alongside military equipment and prisoner crafts. The bottles look unimpressive next to medals and weapons and uniforms. They are commercial products, mass-produced and unremarkable, but they carried more ideological weight than any propaganda poster or political speech. They proved through their mere existence that American power rested on foundations deeper than military force, that abundance itself was a weapon more devastating than bombs, because abundance made people want to join rather than resist, because abundance promised better futures rather than glorious sacrifices, because abundance delivered what ideology only promised. And so the bottles sat in camp canteens, sweating condensation in the summer heat, offering cold refreshment for 5 cents to men who had been told that their hunger made them strong, that American plenty made Americans weak, that history favored the lean and disciplined over the soft and comfortable. The bottles delivered a different message, a simpler message, a message that German prisoners slowly internalized despite years of contrary indoctrination. That comfort was not weakness, that abundance was not corruption, that the ability to buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents represented achievements of organization and production and distribution that mattered more in the long run than martial valor or ideological purity. The bottles taught without preaching, demonstrated without arguing, convinced through experience rather than rhetoric. When the last German prisoner was repatriated in 1947, when the POW camps were dismantled and the land returned to civilian use, when the infrastructure of wartime imprisonment was erased, the bottles remained in memory. Former prisoners told stories to their children and grandchildren, stories about the bizarre experience of comfortable captivity, about the abundance they had encountered in America, about the 5-cent Coca-Cola that represented everything they had misunderstood about their enemy and everything they had been misled about by their leaders. These stories shaped post-war German understanding of America, contributed to West Germany's wholehearted embrace of Western alliance, influenced the political and economic choices that transformed West Germany from occupied ruin to prosperous democracy within a generation. The symbolic power of the 5-cent Coca-Cola extended beyond Germany. It became part of a larger American narrative about freedom and prosperity, about the superiority of democratic capitalism, not through abstract principle, but through material results. During the Cold War, When the United States competed with the Soviet Union for global influence, American propaganda emphasized consumer abundance. Kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev centered on washing machines and televisions, on which system better provided ordinary people with comfortable lives. The logic was identical to the logic embodied in the 5-cent Coca-Cola. That system should be judged by their capacity to deliver material prosperity to ordinary people. That ideology mattered less than outcomes. That the good society was the society that made good lives possible for its citizens, rather than demanding their sacrifice for abstract goals. This was, critics noted, a deeply materialist vision, one that reduced human flourishing to consumer choice and economic productivity. It elevated comfort over meaning, prosperity over purpose, individual satisfaction over collective achievement. It was the vision of bourgeois capitalism, concerned with private pleasures rather than public glory, with accumulation rather than honor, with security rather than struggle. The Nazi critique of this vision had emphasized its spiritual emptiness, its lack of higher purpose, its reduction of human existence to animal satisfaction. The communist critique similarly emphasized capitalist alienation, the reduction of human beings to consumers, the spiritual poverty of societies organized around commodity production. But the German prisoners drinking 5-cent Coca-Cola in American POW camps had experienced the alternative. They had lived under a system that promised higher purpose and delivered death camps and total war. They had sacrificed comfort for glory and discovered that the glory was fraudulent and the sacrifice was real. They had been told that their hardship had meaning, that their hunger made them strong, that their suffering served the fatherland and the Führer and the future. And then they had lost. They had lost absolutely, lost in ways that made clear the suffering had been pointless, that the hardship had achieved nothing, that the meaning they had been promised was a lie constructed to make their exploitation tolerable. And then they were captured and transported to America and discovered that the enemy they had been taught to despise offered them comfortable barracks and abundant food and 5-cent Coca-Cola, that the decadent Americans treated prisoners better than the fatherland had treated its own soldiers. That material comfort was actually quite nice when you were experiencing it rather than being told to despise it. This experience was transformative in ways that went beyond individual psychology. It represented a collective confrontation with the bankruptcy of fascist ideology, a confrontation that happened not through intellectual argument, but through material experience. The prisoners could not reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Eventually, most prisoners resolved the dissonance by abandoning what they had been taught rather than denying what they were experiencing. This process of ideological collapse, repeated across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, represented one of the great mass conversions of the 20th century. A conversion achieved not through preaching, but through demonstration, not through force, but through abundance, not through propaganda, but through 5-cent Coca-Cola. In the long twilight of autumn afternoons, when former prisoners grew old and reflective, when they sat with grandchildren who knew war only from history books, they sometimes tried to explain what it had been like to discover that everything they believed was wrong. They struggled to convey the disorientation of realizing that the enemy was not weak but strong, not decadent but capable, not collapsing but triumphant. They tried to explain the shame of comfortable captivity, the guilt of gaining weight while Germany starved, the confusion of being treated humanely by enemies who had every reason to hate them. And they tried to explain the power of small things, of ordinary comforts, of 5-cent Coca-Cola in glass bottles. They tried to explain that the Coca-Cola mattered not because it was important, but because it was trivial, that its very triviality demonstrated abundance, that societies which could afford to be casual about small luxuries possessed power that societies obsessed with sacrifice could never match. Their grandchildren, growing up in prosperous democratic Germany, surrounded by consumer goods and comfortable lives, often struggled to understand what their grandfathers were trying to convey. The idea that anyone would be shocked by a 5-cent soft drink seemed incomprehensible in a world where Coca-Cola was ubiquitous and cheap. But the grandfathers persisted, trying to bridge the gap between the world they had known and the world their grandchildren inhabited. trying to explain that the prosperous, peaceful, boring Germany of the late 20th century was built on the ruins of the grandiose, suffering, defeated Germany they had served, and that the transition from one to the other, from ideology to pragmatism, from sacrifice to comfort, from glory to prosperity, had been mediated by simple material experiences like 5-cent Coca-Cola in American POW camps. The bottles themselves, the physical objects, became collectibles and museum pieces. Antique dealers sold wartime Coca-Cola bottles to collectors who valued them for their nostalgic appeal. Museums displayed them in exhibits about American wartime culture, about the home front, about how civilian industries adapted to military needs. Occasionally, exhibitions about POW camps included Coca-Cola bottles among the artifacts, alongside prisoner-made crafts and photographs and documents. These bottles, identical to millions of others, had no individual significance. They were mass-produced corporate products, designed to be used once and discarded. But collectively, as symbols, they represented the confrontation between fascist scarcity and democratic abundance, between ideological promise and material delivery, between the old world that was dying in 1945 and the new world that was being born. And in the end, what did the 5-cent Coca-Cola teach? It taught that material conditions matter, that abundance is a form of power, that systems which provide comfort attract loyalty more reliably than systems which demand sacrifice. It taught that human beings, when given the choice, generally prefer prosperity to glory, security to struggle, small daily pleasures to abstract ideals. It taught that democracy armed with industrial capacity defeats totalitarianism armed with ideology, that economic systems which align incentives with desires outperform systems which demand subordination of desires to plans. It taught that the American promise, however modest and materialistic and spiritually shallow it might appear, had power precisely because it was achievable rather than transcendent, because it delivered Coca-Cola for 5 cents rather than promising paradise after struggle, because it worked. These lessons were uncomfortable for intellectuals who preferred that human existence have higher meaning than consumer satisfaction. They remain uncomfortable today for critics who see capitalist consumerism as spiritual death, who argue that comfortable conformity is a form of slavery more insidious than acknowledged oppression, who maintain that the reduction of human life to economic production and consumption represents a betrayal of what humans might become. These critiques have merit. The vision of human flourishing embodied in 5-cent Coca-Cola is indeed limited, indeed materialistic, indeed focused on private comfort rather than public achievement. But it is a vision that does not require death camps or total war, does not demand that millions die to achieve someone's conception of historical destiny, does not insist that present suffering is justified by promised future glory. And for German prisoners in 1945, who had experienced where ideologies of sacrifice and glory led when taken to their logical conclusions, the modest promise of 5-cent Coca-Cola represented something precious. The promise that ordinary life could be enough, that small comforts mattered, that peace and prosperity and boring routine were achievements worth having even if they lacked grandeur. The green glass bottles caught sunlight in camp canteens across America in 1945, casting small dancing reflections on counters where prisoners exchanged nickels for cold drinks. These mundane transactions, repeated thousands of times, carried more historical weight than their participants recognized. They were enacting the defeat of fascism at the level of daily life, demonstrating through casual consumption what the war had proven through violence, that America's power rested not primarily on military force, but on economic abundance, that this abundance derived from industrial capacity and political systems that channeled human productivity effectively, that the resulting prosperity made American power sustainable in ways that fascist attempts to achieve dominance through military conquest and ideological indoctrination could never be. The prisoners drinking those bottles were witnessing the future, a future where West Germany would join the Western Alliance and embrace democratic capitalism and become prosperous and boring and free. A future where the children and grandchildren of Nazi soldiers would grow up drinking Coca-Cola and eating at McDonald's, and watching American movies and speaking American slang. A future where the war would be remembered as a tragic aberration rather than a heroic struggle, where peace and prosperity would be valued over glory and sacrifice, where 5-cent Coca-Cola would seem exactly as trivial as it actually was because abundance had become normal and scarcity had been forgotten. This was victory, not through conquest but through seduction, not through force but through attraction, not through demanding allegiance but through offering benefits that made allegiance seem like a reasonable choice. The 5-cent Coca-Cola, sweating in the summer heat, cold and sweet and carbonated, simple and satisfying and utterly ordinary, represented the promise that democratic capitalism made and kept. That ordinary people could have ordinary pleasures, that comfort was not a luxury reserved for elites, but a condition available to everyone. That prosperity was not something to be deferred until after historical struggles were completed, but something that could be experienced now. Today, for 5 cents, this promise, more than any army or weapon or strategy, built the post-war American order, and it began, for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, with a simple transaction in a camp canteen, a nickel exchanged for a bottle, a thirst quenched and an ideology shattered, all for 5 cents.